Welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Indian Ocean World podcast. I am your host Archishman Chowdhury, a postdoctoral researcher at the Indian Ocean World Center, McGill University. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing to you Professor Ling Zhang, an associate professor of history at the Boston College, the United States of America. Professor Ling Zhang studied history, philosophy, and literature at the Peking University in Beijing. She received her doctorate in history from the University of Cambridge in 2009, where she specialized on the economic and environmental history of medieval North China. Professor Ling Zhang has worked as a lecturer and a postdoctoral researcher at various educational institutions. She has taught at the Newcastle University in the UK from 2008 to 2009. She has worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Harvard University from 2009 to 2011 and at the Yale University from 2011 to 2012. Professor Ling Zhang's latest publication entitled The River, the Plain, and the State, an environmental drama in Northern Song China, 1048 to 1128, was published by the Cambridge University Press in 2016 and was the recipient of the 2017 George Perkins Marsh Prize for the best book in environmental history, which is awarded by the American Society for Environmental History. Currently, she is engaged in two research projects entitled North China During the Medieval Economic Revolution and China's Sorrow or the Yellow River's Sorrow, Environmental Biographies of a River Community. Professor Ling Zhang also serves as an associate researcher at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, where she organizes research seminars and talks on the environment in Asia. She is also a series co-editor for the book series Studies in Environment and History, published by the Cambridge University Press. Today, Professor Ling Zhang will tell us about a climatic anomaly that had struck northern China in the 11th century and had serious long-term consequences. Without much further ado, Professor Ling Zhang, welcome to our show.
Good morning, Achishman. Thank you for having us, and thank you for the generous introduction.
Thank you, Professor Zhang, for being here. I will start off with a general query, as I usually do. What triggered your interest in researching the environmental landscape of northern China, especially the province of Hebei, which features so largely in your book? Like, did it originate from any of the contemporary observations of the region by the People's Republic of China after it was formed in 1950, or was it something that you arrived through your years of training as an historian of northern China?
This is a really fantastic question. I wish I got a chance to talk about it actually in the process of writing the book. It's important. And I think if I may, I would like to actually go back to my younger ages when I just left my hometown in Southeast China for the first time. And it took a 24 hours train, long ride, all the way north to Beijing for the first time to leave home for so long, to attend college. So I remember that was the first time I got a visual kind of first person experience of North China, which I knew nothing about in the past. I recall when my train crossed the bridge over Yellow River, I thought about, wow, this is a North China. The land, the water, everything looks so different from South China. I recall vividly sitting in a train, I asked my father the question, why North China looked so brown, so desolate. There were no trees. The villages and the towns look rather shabby. And the, the the reason I ask questions like this, partly because as a native from southeast part of China, the quite affluent Lower Yangtze Delta region, I inherited, I suppose. I was socialized in such a kind of a Lower Yangtze Delta regional chauvinism. We thought we were the best part of China. We were the wealthiest. We were the most educated. Our local in natural environment was the most beautiful, right? So that's why I think that triggered me as a young student to ask what happened to North China, why it is looks so different from my hometown area. What happened to it? Where were the trees, right? Where did they go? So that was the moment I think laid the foundation for, the next 20 years of my academic career. The question to ask about the regional differences inside China. What made the regional differences? Was it a natural process or something happened? So as I entered my college to study as more and more courses on medieval Chinese history, I began to be educated with these theses, intellectual movement, which is today we call the Tang-Song transition. There's one hypothesis or thesis associated with the middle period of China. And then that thesis told us, that hypothesis told us during the Tang and Song period, during the centuries between the 7th century and all the way to 13th century, China went through this enormous economic revolutionary period. Chinese economy boomed, Chinese population exploded, Chinese technology, institution, Chinese culture in terms of literacy for ordinary people, mass education, everything looks so great. Transportation, everything looks so wonderful. And yet, we don't read enough in existing scholarship what happened in North China. All the progress, all those development I just briefly mentioned seems to be associated with south part of China, especially the lower Yangtze River Valley, where I came from. Right. So this triggered me again to couple with my previous, not kind of expression. So my question was, what happened during the economic revolutionary period? It looked like North China lagged behind. And yet at the same time, South China started to take off. So is there something interesting here? Can I ask a research question about it? So as I went into the research, get into deeper into my graduate study, when I got to Cambridge, I started to seriously take up this question. And I decided to dedicate myself to study North China in order to understand, in order to ask whether or not North China actually participate in a nationwide, or let's say empire-wide economic revolution. I really need to take North China seriously. So when I got into this research, the interesting thing is, the more I looked into economic issue, the more actually I encounter environmental issues. There were all kind of a natural disaster or human caused disasters, or yellow rivers of flooding. The government and local people did not know how to cope with the repetitive, the frequent, very intense disasters, including yellow rivers course shifts and floods. So all these three things, right? First impression, the question about Tang-Song transition, economic progress, and then my notice of intensified disasters. All these things got together to produce the kind of a research I presented to you. So it's kind of a long story, isn't it?
Great. Thank you, Professor Cheng. I'm just going to stay on with this question of environmental disasters, which were coupled with economic disturbances or difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
My first question to you in this regard would be, could you tell us a bit more about the sources that were produced during the Song period and also after the Song period that helped researchers study such environmental anomalies or state-created environmental anomalies, because you have pointed out that there were clearly two different thought processes. For instance, the Song court and the emperor interpreted environmental anomalies as pectogenic events. These were punishments from the heaven because of human misconduct, while there were also serious observers of rivers who would point out that, it's basically the riverbeds that are getting sedimented, and as a result of which you get floods every year after year. What is your take on that?
Right. So let me go to your question about sources first. I think for whoever, anyone who study environmental issues, we must go interdisciplinary. We must incorporate a wide variety of sources. So for me personally, I think there are two strands of sources I utilize in order to study this middle period environmental history. One, I would say, how to utilize existing primary sources, historical sources in kind of a creative ways. So let's face it, when we talk about middle period China during the centuries that I study, when we look at the primary sources, most of the historical material left behind were created by social elites. The educated men who served in the government, who became local gentlemen, who gained prominent positions in their local society. They had wealth, they had political power, they had opportunity, they had the right, and of course, the privilege to learn how to write. It was those men who produced the primary sources for us, right? Most of the primary sources were left behind in that way. So the sources, in a sense, are very highly selective, very biased in terms of the content. They reflect the preference, reflect the desire of elite men of the time. This is this is why when we look at our historiography today, majority of the scholarship today, as we can see, they study, human intellectual history, human politics, elite men, their life, how their life and their social life looked like. There were less sources we can find that that address environmental issues directly. There are very, very few this kind of source materials. So, but on the other hand, there is a advantage about the time period that I study and the kind of a material that we're dealing with. That is those social elites, those privileged, educated men in the time period that I study, they were curious about all kinds of things. There was a serious growth in terms of a mass education, in terms of a literacy of ordinary people. Given that kind of social intellectual background, we notice a lot of even elitist men, even though they were interested in politics, in gaining power, in gaining social prestige, they were curious about all kinds of things happening around them. They would go out to write about gardens, write about trees, or write write about rivers, when they travel around China, between South China, North China, they would document the travel experiences they experienced, that they went through. So in that circumstances, the several centuries that I dealt with in my in my research, we witness a how to say unprecedented amount of material that those social elites, those educated men documented unprecedented, unorthodox materials from which we may have the chance to extract environmental data. For instance, some man would talk about traveling on a boat, cross a river, and accidentally mention a flood, accidentally mention the inconvenience an environmental disaster actually caused to the social life. When we look into one particular genre of material called epitaph, basically the famous important man who died, and the family member invited some social local gentleman or high-ranked official to write a epitaph, to document the biography of the deceased family member. So in those kind of materials, we would accidentally, discover the material such as, oh, this person served in as a local official in this one town, and he organized local people in terms of battling floods in the local area. So I would say most of those people back then, they perhaps did not intentionally try to record environmental events, environmental information for us to study. But nevertheless, they were curious. They observed what happened around them with earnestness. So they document all these information for people like me. So I would go into these old material, not necessarily newly discovered material. They're pretty old. They're already there. They've been used by 2 generations, 3 generations historian already. But I would go into the material with a different eye. I was looking at sand. I was looking at a fish. I was looking at forests. So those old materials supply new information in environmental terms. But then how to utilize them in my kind of research, that requires a little bit more modern, interdisciplinary kind of a perspective. That is, I spend quite a bit of time to educate myself. And I can't say this confidently how well I educated myself, because I just simply went into the fields such as geology, such as ecology, such as hydrology, climate science, just try to learn a little bit what happened there in those disciplines, and how in general sense scientists pursue their studies. What are their criteria? What kind of things do they look for? So I spent several years looking into natural science quite a lot in order to gain certain, to some level, scientific literacy, and also to myself confidence to use contemporary scientific research to reflect back upon my historical data, try to help me to visualize, to imagine what kind of experience medieval Chinese people actually went through. So the reverberation between historical material and a contemporary scientific data, this kind of a process for me is really supplies the real resource and energy for studying the environmental history of Northern Song China, as you read here.
Thank you, Professor Chang. I will now turn to the main event in the environmental drama that you have described, the tragedy of 1048, when the Yellow River moves to northern China and devastates the Hebei province. You have pointed out what kind of an impact this disaster had Of course, you argue that this was a state-created disaster of a long process, a product of a long process when the state prioritized the South, which was the seat of the empire, against the North. But what I wonder is, you point out very graphically the impact, the immediate impact of this tragedy that, 3 seasons of crops are destroyed, survivors either migrate to urban areas or they turn to social banditry. But you also point out that this hydraulic pressure, the state-created hydraulic pressure on northern Song China, had been going on for quite some time. And there were also earlier floods that might not have been recorded. So I wonder if the sources that you described shortly before allow us to sort of, have a have an opinion on whether or not this was expected, or whether or not this could have been prophesied by people or the rural communities who lived near the river.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. This is a very thoughtful question, and I think it's a huge question. Actually, it's pretty hard to answer. Let me try in this way. I think there are two issues related to your question. One is about how contemporary people living in 10th through 12th century, especially those people in North China, including of emperors, high-ranked officials, regional officials, local people, how did they know? What did they know? How did they know? Could they foresee? Could they anticipate? Could they prepare, right, for the devastating disaster or multiple disasters? So this is one issue in regard to people's knowledge. And I think to this issue, I would say there was actually very few, there was quite a little information, only a little information for people to really know about what was about to come. So let me begin with ordinary people, local people living in Hebei on the north side of the Yellow River. For centuries, they did not really experience Yellow River. They did not experience a flooding. They perhaps read about the Yellow River. They perhaps read about it in the literary way, in the kind of poetic or through legends. So most of them had no mundane physical experience with the river. So in this sense, I would assume they knew quite little about the river, and certainly how to cope with the river's monstrous, flood. But in terms of high-ranked officials, the government, they perhaps knew more. They had more. They've seen documents from previous centuries. They've learned from previous dynasties, water managing institutions. They were more prepared, and yet, people living that time, even at the level of the imperial government, they had no large scope knowledge of the Yellow River as an entire watershed, entire Yellow River's valley, from the rivers that began into the river's end. They had to know this comprehensive, holistic view of the topography of North China, how the river winds from the plateau of Tibetan Qinghai all the way to the plateau in the middle reach of the Yellow River on the border between Inner Mongolia, today's Inner Mongolia, and the lowest plateau. They had no idea how the river actually descend in terms of taking the natural gradients from the higher level to the low-lying plain of the North China plain. So they did not have the holistic, comprehensive, large scope knowledge about the topography, about the Yellow River's hydrology. So with the lack of such information, whatever knowledge they had was quite fragmentary, associated with a certain part of the river. So we are talking about, in a sense, unequal, uneven knowledge held by the imperial state. They knew something, but they didn't know everything else. So when they got into the river management, flood management in the 11th century, they were good at coping with certain localized problems, but it was the entire river systems disorder that caused huge catastrophic disaster that we saw, right, in this we see in this period. And a second thing is related to your question. I sense you were asking about the long-term historical and environmental trends that eventually led to this catastrophe in 1048. And you are quite right. The Yellow River's flooding has been going on for a long time. It didn't just happen once and all of a sudden shift the river's body to the north. There were all these the slow, gradual in, if we use a Bordelian concept or longue durée, this kind of building up tendency, that's all together, different kind of tendencies, they work together in concert to lead to the catastrophe in 1048. Let me just name a few of these tendencies, the slow, gradual. One thing is climate change. And in my book, I did not go into climate change sufficiently enough, but I think for the future study, we need to incorporate more historical climate. So if we look at a large trend, that was the time, those centuries were the time period China was situated in the middle of a so-called medieval warm period. So we were looking at this warm period, which led to more humidity and less aridity, and also higher temperatures. So the combination of the humidity and warmer temperature actually helped the development of agriculture, large scale agricultural movement, settlements, colonization of Chinese farmers across entire North China. But this humidity plus a warm temperature was not constant. Actually, during the 9th century, 10th century, 11th century, we began to see upheaval. So we began to see fluctuation in terms of a short time period, weather patterns. So that those fluctuation in terms of short-term weather pattern actually led to short-term acute disasters from different spots of North China. So we're looking at large-scale climate change plus frequent small disasters that led to the disturbance of the entire North China, the environmental system. I briefly mentioned agricultural settlement. So we were talking about, we are looking at the several centuries before 11th century, before 1048, during the Tang dynasty, during the early Song dynasty, we began to see the settlement, colonization, settlement, migration of farmers into certain spots that we today will use the concept of ecotone. Ecotone, these regions, they were ecologically fragile, right? They could switch between being, the animal husbandry, grassland, and sometimes they will be swim back to become agricultural land full of crops. So the several centuries we're talking about before 1048 was the period, massive agricultural practice, the transformation of the landscape, the depletion of trees, and a massive planting of crops in north part of the China, which actually contributed to long-term soil erosion, deforestation, soil erosion, and also the increase of sediments in the Yellow River. So these large scale, centuries long transformation, they had to accumulate to a certain level. Eventually, in the 10th century, we began to see, wow, okay, the soil erosion, deforestation led to all this sand being transported by the river from the river's upper middle reaches all the way to the river's lower reaches, accumulated there, which pushed up the body of the entire river and then pushed the river towards the both sides. That was how the river disaster happened, right? But without addressing the long-term economic, the mode of production, and the climate change, the landscape transformation, and the long-term environmental degradation in terms of the earth, of the of that part of China, of north part of China, we would not be able to understand this momentary disaster in 1048. So my point is, if we look into the long-term historical trend several centuries before 1048, we would understand, okay, there's so many different factors. They interplay with each other. And when we finally moved into 11th century, we start to see the factor of imperial state, the political strategic consideration, which, as you correctly notice from the book, which prioritized the southern part of the river and treating the northern part of the river as a strategic, political, inferior, secondary periphery, or let's say environmental, ecological periphery, right? So all these different factors had to work in concert in order to produce this one disaster. So I think the interesting thing from this study is I got to see how different scales, in terms of spatial scales and in terms of temporal scales, how different scales have to work together in order just to create one event. So that one event of 1048 is truly an embodiment, truly a result of multiple actors, multiple factors, how they cross the span of hundreds of years to get together. So that is how history happened, I suppose, right?
Yes, of course. Well, I will continue with the same train of thought on the long-term impact of 1048, but now let me try and ask you a few questions on what happens in and after the period when the river moves to northern China in 1048. You point out that the river occupies Hebei province for a period of 80 years until it moves south again in 1128. And during this 80-odd-year period or so, the river destroys all the local water channels of Hebei, which usually lead to heavy deposits of silt. And these are often eroded within 2 seasons. So that means farmers cannot plant crops on the same site. And they often have to practice what you have called some kind of a shifting cultivation. And on top of that, they have to pay taxes. For which often they would have to buy different kinds of wood and vegetative stuff from merchants. So all of this, my understanding of the event is all of this had drastically reduced food security in the region of Hebei and, well, in northern China. What kind of complaints or what kind of impact did this have in the long run? Do we hear more about famine or associated phenomena such as bondage and migration caused by famine or lack of food security from the region? Or is it like, after the destruction of the rural economy of Hebei by the Yellow River, and so in order to provide enough food for the rural population, did this lead to increased levels of food production in the commercially viable South? And if this at all happened, what kind of an impact did this have on the socio-political and environmental picture of the South, which was the seat of the empire?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This is an excellent question, and there's just so much going on here. So let me divide your question into two parts. Again, the first part is about the immediate, the negative impacts, the social human tolls, right? And then on the other is the long-term, large scope impact on the society, on the economy, on the entire empire, even in a sense, strangely, as you rightly pointed out, the positive impact on the economy for the entire empire. So the first part, the negative impact. So yeah, you made it very clear here. We are talking about instant impact of the flooding from 1048. But let's clarify here. Yellow River did not just flood once, did not just change the course once. Actually, before 1048, there were disasters, flooding almost every year. After 1048, even though the river crashed northward into Hebei, it did not calm down. It continued invoke all kinds of disaster almost every year, if not several times, several different locations every single year. So the disastrous pattern continues. So when we talk about negative impacts in terms of a social, economic, human tolls, we must recognize the repetitive pattern of the river disaster that basically lend no interval, no time period for resting, for rebounding back, for resilience, for restoring human population or human economy. So we are literally talking about farmers whose farms were destroyed, houses were completely damaged by the flooding. And if they were given enough time, say 10 years or 20 years, the farmers could come back and rebuild the farm, rebuild their houses, and rebuild their economic life. But because of the frequency and unpredictable nature of the river disaster, Hebei's peasants, Hebei's even citizen, residents of urban areas, they could not return home, and they could not easily restore their original life. So in this sense, we began over time to see short-term human tolls on top of a long-term, multi-layered, repeated human tolls. For instance, let me just give you some example here. So 1048, about 1 million people from Hebei were either killed or displaced from their hometown area. So those river refugees had to pack up. If they had any kind of property left with them, they would pack up and start to move away from North China all the way across the Yellow River to south part of China, just to look for food, to look for security. So, but a few years later, when disasters start to recede a little bit, these people began to move back. Only a few years, the river basically caused floods again. So the same people who were the disaster refugee from the previous disaster have to pack up and leave again. So when such kind of things happen again and again, we began to see the loss of Hebei population. Many refugees, they stop moving back to Hebei. They resettle in Henan. They resettle in province called Shandong to the east. They even travel further south to other parts of China, southern part of China, which was more mountainous. A lot of them began to hide in high mountains or in the marshlands, in those marginal space where empire, the imperial state, could hardly reach. So those people became more kind of anarchist, outlaw, bandits. So this time period was a very interesting time period that farmers turned into bandits because of repeated disasters in North China. Also, there are farmers, peasants, and also residents of townships or cities. They actually travel northward across the frontier river to get into the territory of the Liao dynasty, which was the arch enemy of the Song dynasty. So the refugees would risk their life to cross the border in order to pursue security. So it was a very, very interesting experience. So over time, we began to see this mass migration, mass loss of human lives, and Hebei's population dwindled rapidly, and food security is a really, really serious. The government set up regulations, for instance, how much food they would distribute to give as a disaster relief to the refugees. So the government would regulate every day how much food, how much grain in these circumstances. Mainly, that means millet. How much? What are the quantity of millet should be given to every adult? How much grain should be given to every child? But from case to case, we began to read widespread hunger and famine, and even the government, both from the central government and to the regional, local governments, we began to see enormous historical sources complaining about we ran out of food. Our granary were depleted. We couldn't feed all these disaster refugees. What are we going to do? So some of the refugees will basically throw themselves onto the streets to sell themselves to rich people. And even government would encourage rich families, rich people to adopt, quote, quote, adopt the refugees as their servants, as their maid. So this is the bondage issue you talked about, right? And also, in certain circumstances, the government would confiscate, draft men, of course, here, men refugees into the army and use military granary, right, military rationing to support at least a certain part of the male population, because a male population, male body was still deemed useful for their labor. However, this created another problem. Over time, even military supply ran out. The government were unable to sustainably feed this huge amount of a military population. So more and more military soldiers would run away from the government. So imagine this, military soldiers ran away from government with weapons with them. They would roam around the vast land of North China. They would pair up, start to ally with local bandits. They joined the bandits to form large group of rebels, and then they aim to cause huge social changes, political changes to bring down the government. Large-scale rebellions start to take place in the later part of the 11th century. We read about this all the time. So we are literally talking about how the ecological environmental disaster led to the overall bankruptcy of a North China region, such as Hebei, the bankruptcy of the local society, of the local economy, the bankruptcy, even the moral economy. In historical time like this, we're talking about the moral economy worked out as strong social ties among different social groups. Rich people supply charity, right? Supply food, money to poor people. Poor people guaranteed themselves to settle down in the local level to help provide security. We are talking about certain kind of a moral economy which were completely broken down. Both poor people and even at the end, rich people were so afraid of living in North China, Hebei region. They pack up to leave again because they realized there were no social bonds existing in their hometown anymore. So all these things, negative things, and then let's transit quickly to the positive impact that you suggested here. Then what did the state do? Here we began to see this amazing, in a sense, the historical phenomenon that Northern Song imperial government, it began to take on this active, interventionist kind of a approach to deal with environmental, social, economic hardship on the ground. So the state inserted itself to cope with everything. How did it do it? One way the state did it was to recruit, to purchase, to mobilize the transportation of a large scope, a large quantity of a raw material, basic supply, such as food, such as a vegetative material from different parts of the China, which were not devastated by the disaster. This kind of material being, maneuvered, mobilized to transport across more than 1,000 miles to North China in order to feed the refugee, in order to feed the military, in order to supply the hydraulic work to battle the monstrous Yellow River, right? So the state functioned as the mastermind, the organizer, and also the large buyer of goods from South China, right? And so this is a very interesting phenomenon. That means we saw the emergence of a huge market, a consumer base in North China who were hunger for basic things, basic cheap things like food. And the government stepped in to function as the buyer and transportation manager. So this, I really believe, and your observation is right, that this pumped up, this supplies economic incentive to the well-to-do regions in South China to drive up the prices for grain and for other basic supplies. And that will ended up leading to intensified farming practice, agricultural technological innovations in South China, the innovations of shipping technology, especially water-based, inland water-based shipping, all the consumption, the demand supplied the drive for the economic growth in South China. So this is a very bizarre thing, right? We are talking about a disaster, but the disaster became an incentive for production. So in this sense, I think we are truly not just talking about the economic growth in terms of the innocent, pure microeconomic driven economic growth. We're talking about a certain kind of a political economy. The political economy was determined here by the imperial state's sense of a crisis, the sense of a survival, the sense of how to hold these drastically different regions across the empire, hold them together as a whole thing. So I think this observation would, in some way, I think will beautifully actually help us to think about the complexity of a so-called Tang-Song transition, the thesis, the hypothesis that the most of scholars, historians of my period are thinking with, right? How do we cope with this idea, this time period in Thai China have launched its early modern path, right? We began to see a extremely prosperous commercial economy, but at the same time, actually, this prosperous commercial economy was founded by the fact of the socio-economic downfall of North China and the imperial states insistent of not letting it completely falling to fundamental damage, right? So it's a very interesting way of thinking about the empire-wide and large scope historical development. So I wish I would, but in fact, I'm currently dedicating more energy and more time to study these issues. So I'm very glad you brought up this issue.
Thank you, Professor Cheng. I'm fascinated by your work, and let me now ask you a few more questions. I'll ask two more, I promise. The first one is sort of about the the long-term impact again, but not on river hydraulics or not on economic production. But I just wonder, you point out in your work that often hydraulic decision-making at the Chinese courts was a complicated process because it involved the emperor, the emperor's court, and often also the district officials or commissioners of the provinces where these works were to be undertaken. And you also highlighted that often district officials would complain to the emperor that doing hydraulic works without taking into account the local knowledge or the local character of the terrain, of the environment, could lead to serious devastating consequences, as it were with the 1048 disaster. But you also point out that the Song model of hydraulics, despite its failure, was sought to be emulated by the succeeding empires, and not just any ordinary empire, but the big empires like the Ming Empire and also the Manchu Empire later. So my question is, can you tell our listeners very briefly about why even succeeding empires would follow a certain model that they were aware did not always have the positive impact that it intended?
Right. I'll be very brief. If very brief, just one sentence, I would say they had no choice. Let me elaborate on this a little bit, just a little bit. They had the later dynasty, they had no choice for two reasons. So one thing is Song dynasty, Northern Song dynasty we're talking here, was truly the first time period we saw the formation, the development of multifaceted, systematic knowledge of hydraulics, especially in relation to Yellow River. If we look at the previous time period, the time period prior to Northern Song, well, partly we would say Yellow River was quite friendly, quite calm for many centuries between the first one and the all the way to the 9th century, about 9th century. Before Northern Song time period, the river was calm. So there wasn't much accumulated, large scope, systematic, state-driven river knowledge back then. River flooded, but they were more like a local issue, as you mentioned. Local officials dealt with them. It was really the Song period. The river became such a national security level of an issue, implicating the survival, well-being of the entire state. So then we began to see this a multi-layer hierarchical knowledge formations, which also were accompanied by the negotiation, conflicts, and compromise among all of these different institutions and social groups. So it was a time knowledge was gained, and the knowledge was transformed into an entire system, that ranged between science, finance, politics, military strategies, how to use labor, how to innovate civil construction. So it was a good model. It was a really fruitful and kind of knowledge system. So later dynasties inherited. So they had nothing else to inherit. In a sense, I think they had no choice. But on the other hand, very briefly, they had no choice in the sense the river disasters in the centuries after the 11th century, basically throughout the second millennia, Yellow River's disasters were so overwhelming. All governments of a various dynasty, they all tried very hard to control the river, and they all in some sense failed because they were unable permanently eliminate the disaster of the Yellow River. So the Northern Song dynasty practice failed again, but in a sense, it wasn't that fundamental failure. It was just the same experience as a later dynasty. If in terms of protecting the river, preventing the river from destroying the capital of the Northern Song dynasty and guarding the heart, the heart or and the core of the dynasty, the state was quite successful. If we think about that particular goal, the state was actually pretty successful. So fundamentally, all these dynasties, they came to the awareness they were unable to eliminate rivers disaster in any permanent sense. So they were all basically, they all learned from the Northern Song dynasty. Basically, their task was truly to negotiate with this disastrous river and try to negotiate with their own people within their own domain, to negotiate between among different regions, to try to balance out regional interests. So here again, right, in face of the unconquered, untamed river and undomesticable nature, the state, in a sense, yield toward the nature and start to transform the river management into a truly political issue, how to balance interests. So this is what the later dynasty learned, they practiced as well. So I think the message is truly the fundamental inability of a human society, even in the form of the most organized institution, such as the imperial state, as a extremely active interventionist government, in the form of that government, it couldn't truly manage the environmental disasters. It's humbling to talk about this.
Thank you, Professor Chang. I'm going to end today's proceedings with a final question. As I read your book, I thought it sort of demonstrates how developmental projects that don't take into consideration local knowledge can have serious consequences for the environment and also for the people who are supported by that environment. In this respect, I wonder if you would like to reflect on how your work speaks to modern developmental policy making, for instance, real estate in fragile areas like mountains or low-lying plains, or even, places where the risks of flooding sort of multiply with deforestation and erosion of soil cover. Would you like to reflect on that?
Sure, of course. This is such a wonderful point. I think many of us study environmental issues. We began with a acute awareness of environmental problems today, and the difficulty, complexity, and the problematic of our environmental management today. So you were perfectly right about the contrast, the conflicts between local knowledge and official knowledge, the top-down scientific, large-scale knowledge which was organized and held by political institutions and organizations such as the imperial state of the Northern Song. We clearly see the conflicts between the two. So I think you were right. And I think in terms of our modern decision making, in terms of our modern environmental practice, we do need to pay more attention to hear more the opinions of a local people, local society. Much of the local knowledge and many of the local practices have been wiped out completely. But if we pay attention, we perhaps will still notice, still discover the existence of old local knowledge. I think it is precious. But on the other hand, after writing this book, researching Northern Song China, I also came to the realization we should not deify local knowledge. We should not romanticize local knowledge, just as we shouldn't deify and romanticize organized, official, state-oriented knowledge. Because why? As many cases from historical period have told me, much local knowledge was formed and practiced out by local societies or local social groups, communities who cared only about their own benefits, their own interests. So just as how the imperial state would come into the environmental world, try to advance its own interests, many local society actually actively sabotage others and neighbors by protecting and highlighting their own benefits. So let's say this is a pretty sad and really disappointing discovery I found in my research. I really would like to say local knowledge should cure every disease. But in reality, when what I found is under the pressure of mounting pressure from damaging environment, and also because of the heightened depletion and abuse of resources, in circumstances like this, people tend to, both at a higher level and a lower level, tend to grapple with their own desire. And sometimes that will lead to abuse and encroachment of people, living in their neighboring areas. So how to deal with this? I think if we talk about the implication for our modern environmental management, I think we need to understand local knowledge, the diversity of it, respect it, but at the same time, we still need to keep learning and try to gain more large scope, comprehensive, both scientific and humanistic, social scientific knowledge of environmental systems. So both the small scale, the local, and the large scale, the interplanetary, the ecosystematic scale knowledge, we need to basically keep an eye on these different scales, try to work with both instead of zero sum, gray, black and white, try to pick one against the other. So but when we talk about these issues, I think what I learned from my research is often we are talking about political issues here. We are talking about the infights among different human society, human groups. So we are truly talking about a environmental justice issue. So how do we set our eyes on to cure environmental disease, but also with this gaining more awareness that justice is environmental justice, social justice actually is at the core of dealing with any environmental issue. How can we protect our own neighborhood while acknowledging this could cause injustice, trigger injustice toward our neighbor? So how do we balance these different awareness and come up with some compassionate and ultimately sorry, my mind blanks out a little bit. This last sentence, I'm just going to phrase it. How do we come up with both compassionate and also justice sensitive solutions to every issue? I think this is a question for all of us. Last message, very quickly, last message. Studying research project like this make me feel just very sad to see the human arrogance here. often, just like northern Song imperial states and its emperors and high-ranked officials, again, we see these people, men and groups, they demonstrate this desire and confidence that their single solution could deal with everything all at once, all together. And I think fundamentally to speak to contemporary policy makers to address contemporary environmental disasters and which will lead to our future environmental future, which is pretty clear. We have climate change, global warming, all these things are happening right now. But I think the fundamental issue is how we address our human arrogance, our profound, sometimes I think, blind belief in our confidence, in our ability. We are able to conquer nature, but history keeps telling us, sorry, you can't. Many of your good, well-intended, good solutions, scientific solution will end up triggering even bigger disasters. So be humble here. So I think that may help us actually to walk back from many of our previous mistakes.
Thank you, Professor Ling Zhang, for what was a wonderful podcast. I have learned a lot today, and I'm sure our listeners will enjoy every bit of what we have discussed. Thank you once again to my colleague, René Mandeville, who works behind the scenes and helps produce these podcasts. I'm Archishman Chaudhuri, a postdoctoral researcher at the Indian Ocean World Center, and you have been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcasts. That's all we have for today. Bye-bye, take care, and stay safe, everyone.
The Indian Ocean World podcast would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This podcast series is part of the SSHRC-funded partnership project Appraising Risk, Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world.